I'm going to open with some scripture. The first scripture I want to read is James 1, 14 through 15. It says, "But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." The second scripture is 1 Peter 5:8. It says, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, waiting for someone to devour." And I think these two verses, I think you'll be able to see how they fit in as I get into the story. So 4 years ago, I had experienced a traumatic event in my life. It was a Thursday morning. I was sitting on the living room couch with my wife. She was sitting next to me, and I was looking straight ahead, just kind of eyes glazed over, and without looking at her, I just blurted out, "Sweetie, I lied to you last night." Lying to your spouse is bad, but I'll give you a little context. For the 2 weeks leading up to that morning, we had been in some pretty serious conflict about an admission that I had made of having an emotional affair with with one of my coworkers. And through that, the night before, she had asked me flat out, "Did you sleep with her?" To which I responded, "Of course not. No way. I would never do that." So that context, admitting to her that morning that I lied to her the night before, kind of gives that little lie a little more punch. And that morning started a 9-day process of me admitting to my wife that her ultra-Christian husband of 12 years that had led her to Christ, that had led Bible studies and small groups with her through their church, had not only cheated on her with the woman in question, but had cheated on her with other women, had been looking at pornography for longer than she knew me, and had been addicted to it for about 10 years by that point. I began to see a counselor shortly after that specialized in this arena. And soon after that, I had a new identity and a new label. I had Christian, husband, father, son, brother, friend. And to that, I got to add sex addict. Not the label I wanted to add to my resume. No one grows up saying, "I want to be an addict." And no one grows up saying, "How can I inflict the most emotional pain on my loved ones as I possibly can?" And no one becomes an addict overnight. It's usually the process of a lot of really bad decisions, a little bit off, a little bit off, a little bit off, before you look around and say, "How in the world did I get here?" That's pretty much what happened to me. Growing up, I was a Christian kid. I was in church every Sunday. High school, very involved in my youth group, very involved in a ministry called Young Life. Young Life volunteer in college, worked at their summer camps several times. I was a good student, I was a good athlete, but really, if you were to ask most of the people I grew up with, my identity was, he was Mr. Christian, he was Mr. Faith. That is Mark. And really, by the time I got through high school and college, I was starting to take pride in that identity, which, taking pride in being a good Christian is, a whole nother dynamic for a different talk. But my freshman year in college, second semester of my freshman year in college, I caught my first glimpse of pornography on a computer lab, in a computer lab. I had been pretty sheltered, so I had never seen anything like this. And it was intriguing, it was interesting, it piqued my curiosity. And so throughout college, for the next 3.5 years, I would, curiosity would get the best of me, and I would browse casually here and there. I would search for things online, and just nothing routine, just, when the opportunity presented itself, I would take advantage of it. And in my head, I would remember my youth group leader and my Young Life leader in high school saying, "Don't look at pornography. It'll change the way you think." And I sat there, and I would process that and think, that's not going to happen to me. Number one, I respect women way too much. Number two, I'm way too smart to let that happen to me. And three, I'm much too Christian to have that happen to me. My faith is much too big to get dragged into this. What I didn't realize was as I looked through college, that casual browsing was giving Satan this little foothold that he needed to absolutely drag me down and consume my life for the next few years. After college, at the time, my fiance and I, we got married. Got married, we moved to Charlotte. I continued to look at pornography secretly. And really at this point is when it became much more consistent. We were a young couple, we were both working full-time, trying to make ends meet. And so I would take on some freelance jobs. I was in the computer industry, and so I would take on some freelance jobs that I would work on at night. And so suddenly I had consistently was up late after she went to bed, on the computer, by myself, and really tired. Some people will drink coffee. Some people will drink soda to stay awake. I looked at pornography. I had two windows open. It's my work window and some sort of pornography over here that would just keep my mind going. It would keep me awake as I was up working. What I realized, well, without realizing it, over the course of looking at pornography for 5 or 6 years, it did change the way I think. And more specifically, it really reprogrammed the way I think. I walked away with, or it taught me two things. One, sex is casual. I mean, you don't see any wedding rings in pornography. It's not special. If it's available, you take it. And secondly, it changed the way, when you look at pornography, you don't just look at it as a third party. You put yourself in the scenes. You put yourself in with this woman. You put yourself in with this scene. Much like if you ever hear interviews with athletes, football players, basketball players, hockey players, that they visualize. They will visualize the plays they're supposed to run. And if you ask them why, they'll say, so that when I get in that situation, I know how to react. I don't have to think. My body just does what it's supposed to because I've gone through this scenario over and over again. And that was the same thing I was doing with pornography. I spent 6 years visualizing. And it came out, and I could give several examples, but one way that I knew that it was really changing the way I thought in reprogramming my thought process was there were several situations where I came to a fork in the road. I could make this choice, do the right thing, not turn on the computer, not go to an inappropriate site, not go meet this woman, not go put myself in this bad situation, or I could go do all that stuff. And some people have a still small voice in the back of their head. On most of these occasions, I had a very loud, screaming voice in the back of my head saying, please just go this way, just once, choose right. And inevitably, because I had programmed myself, if it's available, we're going over here. And so time after time, I would follow the opportunity. I would follow the quick fix situation. And as soon as I made that decision, my brain would just go quiet. And it was like I was on autopilot. Because again, in my head, I had gone through this routine and this scenario over and over and over again. And I knew what was going to happen next, and I knew how it was going to end. And it was just, it had been visualized. So over the years, as you can imagine, trying to keep up this ultra-Christian, Mr. Christian persona over here and taking part in all of this, in the pornography and the lustful thoughts on this side, I had a ton of internal conflict. You can't keep both of those lives going without a little bit of internal conflict. And I was doing my best to keep a foot in both camps because I liked that people thought of me as this person over here, but I liked this stuff over here too much, and I didn't know how to stop. John Ortberg says in his book, God is Closer Than You Think, that this type of situation, it enables you to get the worst of all worlds. You experience a kind of chronic, low-level hidden debauchery, so you're frustrated by all the fun that you think the major league debauchery professionals are having. Yet you get just enough spiritual and religion input so you have a chronic, low-level guilt about the amount of depravity that you are engaged in. It reminds me of a scripture verse that God says, either be hot or cold, but lukewarm makes me sick. And I was absolutely lukewarm. So after living this way for about 10 years, I went out on a run. And at this point, pornography had really started to take control of my life. This little problem, this little casual looking, had gotten to the point where I was fully addicted, and there were many days where I could not get through a day without looking at something. So I went out on a run one evening. It was an August evening in 2011. I went for a run, and I heard this voice in my head again. And it wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet. It was just very directive. And it said, Mark, it's time to come clean, and it's time to tell her. And I ignored that voice. And I heard it again. Mark, it's time to come clean, and it's time to tell her. I thought about it for a second, and I believe I actually audibly responded with, there is no flipping way I'm telling her this stuff. You have got to be kidding me. I don't know where this voice is coming from, but you're nuts. But it wouldn't be quiet, and it just kept going, and just kept going. And as the miles went on, it was the same thing. It's time to come clean. It's time to tell her. It's time to come clean. It's time to tell her. So I figured out, all right, what can I tell her that's not really going to get me in trouble, but will get this voice to shut up? And so the year before, my wife had suspected that I was having an emotional affair with a woman at work. She had no idea that it went so much further than that. And I thought, you know what? She suspects this. I'll admit to this. I'll come out looking like I'm a good guy because I'm admitting something that she already knows. No damage done. We'll move on. Case closed, and this voice will be quiet. So I got home after my run, told my wife I needed to talk to her later that night. So we sat down on the couch, and I admitted. I said, you know what, sweetie, you're right. I had an emotional affair with this woman, and I'm sorry, and it won't happen again. And in my head, great, case closed, going on. What I realized is the same way that looking at those first few images in college gave Satan that toehold that he needed to pull me down into this crap, admitting to that emotional affair was that little step of faith that God needed to start pulling me out. And for the next 2 weeks, my wife started to ask questions to the point that I hated her questions, because every time she asked, I had to admit something else. I had to reveal something else. In my carefully constructed world, my secret life and my public life, and all the control that I had worked so hard to keep was unraveling by the day. It finally kind of came to that boiling point on a Wednesday evening. I was going to work from home the next day and told my wife, I said, hey, I forgot something at work that I need to work from home, so I'm going to drive in and get it. And it was about 10 o'clock at night. And I'm driving in, work was about 20 minutes away. And 5 minutes into the trip, my wife called me on my cell phone. And she asked me, did you sleep with her? To which I responded, no, didn't happen. Absolutely not. She hung up the phone, and she went to bed. I hung up the phone and threw it against the footboard, screamed at the top of my lungs for the next 15 minutes. Ended up in my office with bruises on my hand from pounding on the steering wheel the whole way, because I knew that the next morning my life was going to be over, and there was no way around it. I sat in my office, and what should have been a 5-minute trip in and out to grab this stack of papers turned into about an hour. An hour of me pacing, an hour of me sweating, an hour of me bargaining with God, an hour of me trying to figure out some way to get out of what was about to happen. And it came to an end when I sat in my desk chair and just was rocking back and forth because I had no idea what I was going to do. And I basically looked at God in the eye and said, you know what? You are all-powerful. The wind and waves, obey your voice. World hunger is no problem for you. You could bring world peace without batting an eye. But this is my stuff, and you're not big enough for my stuff. You are not big enough to handle my situation. And I got up, and I walked out of my office, and I was absolutely numb. So that next morning, I had this conversation with my wife. What would have been fair is for her to pick up the kids and walk out. It's certainly what I deserved. But she didn't, only because at that point, she had much bigger faith than I did. Since then, in the 4 years since then, been through lots of counseling, individual and group counseling. I've had more uncomfortable talks with my wife than I can even count. It was 3 to 6 hours a night, every night, for months and months and months to work through this. I knew as the story started to come out and as people started to learn about it, some people would react well and some people wouldn't. And I had people that reacted not well and never wanted to see me again. And I had people that came up and just gave me a hug because they knew that's what I needed. Because at the time, I didn't have a whole lot of friends. 4 months after that 9-day period where I revealed everything, I was convicted by another thought, by another thing that had happened in the past. And I thought, is this something that I need to reveal? It wasn't a big headline thing. It was kind of a lower level detail, smaller issue. I thought, do I reveal it? Do I tell my wife? Do I not tell my wife? And finally, went to church on a Sunday and was absolutely convicted. Yes, you need to tell her. So that night, I told my wife what this other thing was. And after the fact, I just broke down. And I wept and I sobbed uncontrollably on her shoulder for, 20 minutes. It seemed like an hour, but it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. And I felt absolutely broken. I was hating myself. I felt like a total failure. And I just had this thought in my mind, why can't I get out of my own way so that I can make progress? Every time we make progress, I get in the way, and we're back to square one, and we're rebuilding all over again. The next day at work, and that turned out to be the last thing I ever had to reveal. I didn't know that at the time, but in hindsight it was. The next day at work, I had this pit in my stomach, and I didn't know what it was, but I felt like there was some message trying to get through. And so I brought my journal out, like my counselor told me to, and just started writing stuff down. What was I thinking? What was I feeling? What was going on? And by the end of the day, I had a message, a one-line message from God that said, there's so much more to, hang on, let me get this right. There's so much more that I am. And I looked at that and thought, it was just kind of reassuring to hear God say that for the last 4 months, I had done nothing but look at the deepest, darkest, ugliest parts of my life. And I had totally neglected being a husband, or not neglected, but forgot about being a husband and a father and a friend and all the other good things that make up who I am. And he just didn't want me to forget and label myself as this failure sex addict that was never going to get better. About that same time, I remember tucking my son into bed one night. He was about 6 years old at the time, and extremely perceptive, extremely perceptive. So he knew what was he knew something wasn't right. And really anybody could have walked into our house and figured out something's not right. And my routine, we tried to stay in the same bedtime routine. My routine was to tuck him into bed every night. And so I tucked him into bed, and he looked at me and said, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." And I thought, well, I think my response was, "Hey, bud, why don't you just worry about the best you can be and not worry about trying to be like anyone else?" And inside, I thought, oh, please don't do that. Please don't grow up like me. Please don't make the mistakes I made. Please do it better than I did. And I realized that my calling to be an example to my son of what a good dad and what a good husband is supposed to be, I had failed miserably at up to that point. So I read a tweet by John Ortberg a little while ago, and it said, "The only way to fix a broken story is to embed it in a larger story that begins and ends well." And so God has given me either amazing opportunities or amazing stupidity to stand up in places like this and share this. And he's given my wife and I the chance to share our stories and to talk to other people that we know have a very similar story. And him, by his strength, is taking this broken story that is mine and wrapping it around with a good beginning and a good end. About a year ago, and I'll wrap up with this. About a year ago, about 36 months into my recovery process, I was sitting on my couch having a quiet time, just journaling, and I felt this message from God again. I haven't heard a lot of them, but when I hear them, I try and pay attention. And I was thinking back over just what had happened over the last 36 months. And the same way I looked at God in my office that night and said, talk to him, I felt like he was looking right back at me that morning. And he said, "Hey, Mark, 3 years ago, you looked at me and said that I'm not big enough. Look at where you are now. You still have a wife. You still have kids. You still have your house. You still have your job. You still have some friends. You didn't think I was big enough. And then I give you another message, and you kind of misinterpreted that. The message was, hey, bud, there's so much more that I am. You haven't even scratched the surface of how much I love you, of how much grace I have, of how faithful I am, of what I can do for you in your life if you just follow me." And that was a year ago, and I still don't fully understand it. What he sees in me. Because if all things are fair, I'm living alone in an apartment right now, visiting my kids every other weekend. Instead, by his grace, I'm standing on this stage, and I get to go home to a wife and kids that still miraculously love me. So, thank you.